Grant Whitfield ran an empire built on silence and control. For years he trusted no one and let nothing surprise him. Then one rainy October night, everything changed. From the window of his penthouse, Grant watched his neighbor, a quiet woman named Marnie Calloway, get cornered by 3 men in the parking garage below. She fought back hard, and something about the way she moved told him this wasn't random. Grant couldn't look away. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment would unravel every secret his family had spent decades hiding. Marnie was not the kind of woman anyone expected to catch a mafia boss's attention. She was a baker, soft-spoken, private, and completely unaware that her new apartment building was owned by one of the city's most dangerous men. She kept to herself, baked bread before sunrise, and never asked questions about the quiet tension that seemed to follow certain neighbors. That night in the garage changed everything. She survived the attack, but the fear stayed with her long after the men disappeared into the dark. Grant told himself he stepped in only because something felt wrong, not because he cared. He was a man who read danger for a living, and those 3 men moved like they'd been trained, not like street thugs looking for an easy target. He didn't know their names yet, but he sensed this wasn't over. He was right. 6 months later, Marnie found something that changed both their lives forever. An old file hidden in a storage unit that connected her family to his in ways neither of them could have imagined. What started as a chance encounter in a parking garage became the beginning of a war neither of them asked to fight. Secrets Grant's father buried decades ago were about to surface, and the people who once feared him were about to learn his one weakness, a woman he swore he'd never let get close. By the time the truth came out, it was already too late to protect either of them. Grant lost the shield he'd spent his whole life building. Marnie lost the quiet, ordinary life she thought she had. But together, they uncovered a betrayal that reached farther than either of them ever expected, one that would either destroy them both or bring them closer than they ever imagined. A random act of violence in a parking garage turned into a fight for the truth, and 2 strangers became each other's only chance at survival. Rain hit the windows in slow, steady sheets that night, blurring the city lights into streaks of orange and white. Grant stood alone near the glass, a drink in his hand he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The building below him was quiet, the kind of quiet he'd learned never to trust completely. He owned the place, though almost no one in it knew that. A shell company held the deed, and Grant liked it that way. Distance kept things clean. His eyes drifted, out of habit more than interest, toward the parking structure across the courtyard. A door opened. Marnie stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the wind, keys already in hand. He knew her only in passing, a nod in the hallway, a comment about the weather once by the mailboxes. Nothing more. She wasn't someone he thought about. Then 3 men stepped out from behind a row of parked cars. They didn't rush her. That was the first thing Grant noticed, and the thing that made his stomach tighten before his mind caught up. Street thugs moved fast, sloppy, driven by adrenaline and greed. These men spread out slowly, deliberately, boxing her in near the elevator bay like they'd walked the layout before. One of them checked over his shoulder, scanning the garage the way a man does when he's worried about witnesses, not opportunity. Grant's jaw tightened. He set the glass down without looking away. Marnie backed against the wall, her purse slipping from her shoulder, and for a moment Grant expected her to freeze the way most people did in that kind of fear. She didn't. Her hand came up fast, catching the nearest man across the jaw hard enough to stagger him. It wasn't practiced, not exactly, but it wasn't panic either. It was something closer to instinct sharpened by necessity, the kind people don't have unless life has forced it into them. Grant leaned closer to the glass, watching the second man grab for her arm, watching her twist free of his grip in a way that surprised even him. Whoever taught her that, she remembered it well. He told himself he was only watching to see how it played out. That was the excuse he gave himself, the same one he'd used 100 times before when his interest ran deeper than he wanted to admit. But something about the scene nagged at him. The men weren't hunting for a purse. They weren't reacting to resistance like men caught off guard. They were adjusting, recalibrating like professionals dealing with an unexpected variable. That thought settled cold in Grant's chest. He didn't know their names. He didn't know who sent them or why they'd chosen tonight, or why they'd chosen her. All he knew was that nothing about this felt random, and men like him had survived a long time by trusting that feeling. For a moment longer, he stood at the window watching a woman he barely knew fight off 3 strangers in the rain, telling himself this was nothing more than an unlucky night in a city full of them. He had no idea he was watching the very first move of something much bigger, something aimed directly at him. Grant grabbed his coat before he'd even decided to move. By the time he reached the elevator, some part of him was already rehearsing what he'd say, how casual he'd sound, how little of himself he'd let show. He wasn't going down there to save anyone. Men like him didn't play hero not because they lacked the nerve, but because heroes drew attention, and attention was the one thing Grant avoided at all costs. The garage smelled like wet concrete and gasoline when he stepped out of the stairwell. He kept his pace unhurried, hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man who'd simply heard a noise and wandered over to check. The three men clocked him instantly, their eyes flicking his way with the kind of sharpness untrained thugs never had. Grant clocked them right back, cataloging the way they stood, the way their jackets sat a little too heavy on one side, the way none of them had bothered to run yet even with a witness now watching. He didn't say much. A few words about hearing shouting, a glance toward the security camera mounted near the elevator, just enough to plant the idea that this had already been seen, already been recorded, already been made complicated. It worked exactly the way he expected. The men exchanged a look, muttered something to each other, and backed off into the dark without another word. No confrontation. No threats. Just a quiet retreat, like men calling off a job rather than losing a fight. Marnie stood frozen against the wall, chest heaving, watching him with an expression Grant couldn't quite place. Gratitude maybe. Suspicion more likely. He offered her nothing more than a short nod and a line about being careful walking alone at night, then turned and walked back toward the stairwell before she could ask him anything real. Upstairs, alone again, Grant poured himself another drink and didn't touch that one either. His mind had already left the garage behind and gone somewhere colder, somewhere older. He thought of Desmond Voss, a name he hadn't let himself dwell on in years. Voss had been circling the edges of his territory for over a decade, patient in a way that unsettled Grant more than open aggression ever could. Patient men didn't forget. They waited. The timing bothered him most. 3 trained men, converging on a woman with no criminal ties, no debts, no reason to be a target, in a building Voss had no official way of knowing Grant owned. That last part gnawed at him. Voss knew about the building, he knew more than he should. And if he knew that much, this wasn't an isolated attack. It was a message, or worse, a test. Grant made himself a quiet promise that night, one he didn't say out loud to anyone. He would find out exactly who sent those men and why they'd chosen her. What he didn't know was that 3 floors below him, Marnie was lying awake asking the very same question about him, wondering why a stranger who barely spoke to her had known exactly how to make 3 armed men disappear without lifting a fist. Marnie had moved into the building 8 months earlier, and in all that time, almost no one in it could say they really knew her. She kept a routine that rarely changed. Up before dawn, into the small kitchen she'd converted into a home bakery, flour dusted across her counters by the time most of the building was still asleep. She sold bread and pastries out of a folding table at the farmer's market on weekends, kept her curtains drawn, and never lingered long enough in the hallway for small talk to turn into anything more. People assumed things about her because of how she looked and how quiet she stayed. Soft, harmless, easy to overlook. Grant had assumed the same, right up until the moment he watched her drop a grown man with 1 clean hit in a dark parking garage. The next morning, she knocked on his door before he'd even finished his coffee. She held a small paper bag, still warm, cinnamon bread from the batch she'd baked at 5 that morning. It wasn't a peace offering exactly, more like an obligation she felt she owed him, the kind of gesture people make when they don't know how else to say thank you without saying too much. You didn't have to do that, she said, meaning the garage, not the bread. Neither did you, Grant answered, meaning the way she'd fought back instead of freezing. She studied him for a second longer than felt comfortable, like she was recalculating something. Most people would have called the police. Or run. You did neither. Grant gave her the kind of vague answer he'd perfected over the years, something about not liking bullies, something forgettable enough to end the conversation. She didn't buy it. He could see that clearly in the way her eyes narrowed just slightly, the way she tilted her head as if listening for what he wasn't saying rather than what he was. You're not just some guy who lives upstairs, are you? She said. It wasn't really a question. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he took the bread, thanked her, and told her to be careful walking to her car for a while. She nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the door. I don't scare easy, she said. In case you were wondering. Then she was gone, and Grant stood there holding a bag of cinnamon bread, oddly unsettled by a woman who baked pastries at dawn and read people like an open file. He told himself it meant nothing. She was just observant, sharper than he expected, nothing more. But some quiet part of him kept circling back to the moment in the garage, the way she'd moved, the way she hadn't hesitated. Ordinary women didn't fight like that. Ordinary women didn't stand in a doorway and see through a man who'd spent his whole life making sure no one ever could. He didn't know it yet, but that morning marked the beginning of something neither of them had asked for, something that would unravel everything both of them thought they understood about their own lives. Grant made 3 calls that afternoon, each one to a man who owed him something he'd never have to name out loud. By evening, a folder sat on his desk with grainy photos, license plates run through channels that didn't officially exist, and a name that meant nothing to him yet but would soon mean everything. The 3 men weren't affiliated with any crew Grant recognized, which told him something on its own. They were freelance, hired through a payment trail that had been scrubbed clean twice, the kind of scrubbing that cost real money and real patience. Whoever put this together didn't want it traced back easily. But nothing stayed hidden forever from someone who'd spent his life learning where to look. The account led to a shell company 2 layers removed from anything obvious, but Grant recognized the pattern the second he saw it. He'd seen Voss operate this way before, always distant, always deniable, never his own hands on anything that could be traced back to him directly. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to turn a suspicion into something closer to certainty. What bothered Grant more than the connection to Voss was the target itself. He pulled together everything he could quietly learn about Marnie, and none of it made sense. No debts worth mentioning. No family disputes, no ex with a grudge, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket that stood out. She paid her rent on time, kept to herself, ran a small bakery business that barely broke even most months. There was nothing about her life that explained why 3 trained men would be sent after her specifically. Unless the target was never really her at all. The thought settled into Grant slowly, then all at once. She lived 2 doors down from him in a building almost no one knew he owned. If Voss had somehow learned that detail, then Marnie wasn't the point of the attack. She was proximity. She was a way to draw Grant out of the shadows he'd spent years disappearing into, a way to see how he'd react when someone close to him was threatened. Grant started watching her more carefully after that, not out of doubt, but out of something closer to guilt he wasn't ready to admit to. Every time he saw her heading out for the market, every time he heard her moving around in the apartment next door, he felt the weight of a decision he hadn't made yet but knew was coming. If she really had nothing to do with any of this, then she was in danger for no reason other than living too close to him. That night, Grant sat with the folder open long after he'd memorized every page in it. The attack hadn't been random. He was certain of that now. What kept him from sleeping wasn't the certainty itself, but the question sitting quietly underneath it, the one he couldn't shake no matter how he turned it over. If this was only the opening move, what came next wouldn't stop at a parking garage. And whatever it was still coming. 3 weeks passed without incident, long enough that Grant almost let himself believe the danger had cooled off. Almost. He still watched the hallway a little too closely, still noted when Marnie's lights came on in the morning and off at night, a habit he told himself was practical, nothing more. Then came the call that shattered whatever quiet he'd allowed himself. It was late, past midnight, when he heard it through the shared wall, a crash followed by silence too sudden to be nothing. Grant was out his door before he'd fully processed moving, crossing the hall in seconds, finding Marnie's apartment door already cracked open, the lock splintered clean. He stepped inside first, ahead of her, ahead of any thought of caution. The place had been torn apart, drawers pulled out and dumped, couch cushions sliced open, books swept off shelves in messy piles across the floor. It looked like a robbery at first glance, exactly the kind meant to be dismissed by police in 5 minutes and forgotten by morning. But Grant noticed what wasn't there. Her laptop sat untouched on the counter. A jewelry box, cheap but visible, hadn't been opened. Whoever did this hadn't been looking for anything worth pawning. They'd been looking for something specific. Marnie stood frozen in the doorway behind him, one hand pressed against the frame, breathing hard but holding herself together in a way that told Grant she'd been through worse than this before, even if she'd never say so out loud. He told her not to call the police yet, just for a minute, and to his surprise, she listened without arguing. "Nothing valuable is missing," Grant said quietly, more to himself than to her. Marnie's eyes moved slowly across the wreckage, and something shifted in her expression, a flicker of understanding chased quickly by fear. "My uncle," she said finally. "He passed away last year. Left me a storage unit out past the highway. I never even opened it. Never had the time or honestly the heart to go through his things." Grant turned to look at her fully now. "What did he do for work?" She hesitated. "Accounting, I think. Old company closed down years ago. I don't really know much about it. We weren't close." Something cold settled in Grant's chest, the same feeling he'd had the night in the garage, except sharper now, more certain. This wasn't about Marnie. It had never been about Marnie. Somewhere in a storage unit she'd never bothered to open sat whatever Voss actually wanted. Something valuable enough to send men twice now, something worth tearing an apartment apart in the middle of the night to find. He didn't say any of that out loud yet. Instead, he helped her gather what she needed for the night, walked her back to his apartment because there was no way he was letting her stay alone after this, and sat with the weight of a new certainty pressing down on him. Whatever was hidden in that storage unit, they needed to find it before Voss's men did. They drove out past the highway the next morning, the city thinning into flat stretches of storage lots and empty fields. Neither of them said much. Marnie kept her eyes on the window, arms crossed tight against her chest, while Grant gripped the wheel a little harder than the drive required. Both of them were thinking the same thing, turning it over in silence, neither ready to say it out loud first. The storage unit sat at the end of a long row, the kind of place that rented cheap and asked no questions. Marnie's hand shook slightly as she worked the key into the lock, the metal door groaning as it rolled up to reveal stacked boxes covered in a thin layer of dust, untouched since her uncle passed. They worked through them slowly at first, old clothes, photographs, things that meant nothing to anyone but family. Then Grant's hand landed on a box near the back, heavier than the rest, filled with folders instead of memories. He pulled one out and went still. "What is it?" Marnie asked, watching his face change. Grant didn't answer right away. He was staring at a name typed neatly at the top of an old employment record. Her uncle's name, listed beside a company Grant recognized instantly, one his father had quietly controlled through a string of shell businesses decades ago. An accountant. Of course he'd been an accountant. The kind of man who saw every number that moved through an operation like Grant's father ran. Deeper in the box, they found a ledger, handwritten, careful, detailing payments made to men whose names Grant had heard only in passing from his father's old stories. And there, appearing again and again beside the largest transfers, was a name that made Grant's stomach turn cold. Desmond Voss. The ledger told a story neither of Grant's father nor anyone else had ever told him directly. A deal gone wrong, territory promised and never delivered, money funneled quietly into accounts that should never have existed. Marnie's uncle hadn't just tracked the numbers. He'd witnessed the betrayal that split Grant's father and Voss apart 30 years earlier. Marnie sat back on her heels, the color draining from her face. "He died of a heart attack," she said quietly. "That's what they told me. He was 62, no history of heart problems, and it just happened." Grant said nothing because there was nothing comforting left to say. A man who kept records like these, records dangerous enough to still matter 3 decades later, didn't die quietly by accident. Someone had made sure of that. Marnie looked up at him, her eyes hard now instead of frightened. "Your family did this." Grant met her gaze and didn't look away, even though every instinct told him to. "My family," he said slowly, "might have done a lot of things I never knew about." The invitation came 2 days later, no threat attached to it, just a time, an address, and a name Grant hadn't heard spoken directly to him in years. Desmond Voss wanted to meet, alone, at a restaurant quiet enough that half the tables sat empty even at dinner hour. Grant went without telling Marnie exactly where, only that he needed a few hours and that she should stay somewhere safe until he got back. She didn't argue, though the look she gave him said she understood more than he wanted her to. Voss was already seated when Grant arrived, an older man with the kind of calm that came from decades of never needing to raise his voice. He didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake, just gestured toward the empty chair across from him like they were old friends catching up rather than men whose families had been circling each other for 30 years. "You found the ledger," Voss said, not a question. Grant sat down slowly. "You knew I would. I was counting on it." Voss folded his hands on the table, unhurried. "Your father took territory that belonged to me. Buried the proof, buried the man who kept the records, and let everyone believe I simply lost my nerve all those years ago. I didn't lose anything. It was taken." Grant kept his expression flat, though something inside him had already started to shift. "So you sent men after a woman who had nothing to do with any of it." "She had everything to do with it," Voss said. "She just didn't know it yet. I needed to know if the ledger still existed, and I needed to know how far you'd go to protect something you cared about. You've spent years making sure no one could find a weakness in you, Grant. No family close enough to threaten, no one you'd step outside your walls for." He paused, letting the words settle. "Then I watched you walk down to that parking garage yourself instead of sending someone else to handle it." The realization hit Grant like a slow, cold wave. Every move he'd made since that first night, the garage, the questions, the digging, all of it had been exactly what Voss wanted to see. He hadn't outsmarted anyone. He'd confirmed every suspicion Voss needed confirmed, one careful step at a time. You used her to get to me, Grant said quietly. I used her to see you, Voss corrected. There's a difference. Now the whole network knows exactly where to aim if they ever want to hurt you. Grant left the restaurant without finishing his drink, the weight of the conversation settling heavier with every step. When he returned and told Marnie what Voss had said, watching her absorb the truth of it, he saw something break quietly behind her eyes, not fear this time, but the specific kind of anger that came from realizing she'd never been anything more than a tool in someone else's war. I never asked to be part of this, she said. I know, Grant answered. But you are now. And so am I. Grant spent the next 2 days reading the ledger line by line, not looking for what Voss wanted him to find, but for what Voss hoped no one ever would. Somewhere in those careful handwritten entries, he was certain there had to be a piece of the story Voss had conveniently left out during their conversation over dinner. He found it on the third read-through, a set of altered figures near the back pages, numbers that didn't match the earlier entries in the same handwriting. Someone had gone back after the fact and changed them, covering a gap that only made sense if Voss himself had skimmed money meant for the men below him, then blamed the shortfall on the very deal he claimed Grant's father stole from him. Marnie sat across the table while Grant laid it all out, her uncle's careful notes now making a different kind of sense. He didn't just record the betrayal, she said slowly. He recorded who really committed it. Grant nodded. Voss didn't lose his territory because my father cheated him. He lost it because the men above him found out he'd been stealing first. My father just made sure the story got rewritten so no one asked more questions. It wasn't innocence for his family, Grant knew that clearly, but it changed the shape of what he was dealing with. Voss hadn't spent 30 years nursing a righteous grudge. He'd spent 30 years protecting a lie. Grant didn't move against Voss directly. He didn't need to. Instead, he made sure select pages of the ledger found their way quietly to 2 men still active in Voss's own network, men old enough to remember the original deal and sharp enough to recognize altered numbers when they saw them. He said nothing publicly, made no accusations himself, simply let the truth travel through channels that had no reason to doubt where it came from. The shift happened slowly at first, then all at once. Meetings Voss wasn't invited to. Calls that went unanswered. Men who'd stood beside him for decades suddenly finding reasons to keep their distance. Voss had built his return on being the wronged man, the one owed a debt 30 years overdue, and that story only worked as long as no one saw the ledger's final pages. Marnie didn't step back from any of it, even when Grant offered her the chance to. She sat with him late into the nights going through what remained of her uncle's records, driven less by revenge and more by a need to understand the man who raised her in his stories, and how he'd ended up dead because he'd known too much. He kept this hidden for 30 years, she said one night, staring at his neat, careful handwriting. He knew exactly what it was worth, and what it would cost him. Grant watched her, understanding for the first time that she wasn't in this because of him anymore. She was in it for her uncle, for the truth he died protecting, and for the ending he never got to see. Voss's carefully built world was starting to come apart, one loyal man at a time, and neither he nor Grant's father had ever imagined the final blow would come from a quiet baker no one thought to take seriously. It took less than a month for Voss's world to come apart completely. The men who once stood loyal beside him for decades quietly stepped back one by one, unwilling to keep defending a story that no longer held together under the weight of the truth. No dramatic confrontation ended it. No violence marked the finish. Voss simply woke up one morning to find the network that once feared him had moved on without a word, leaving him with a name that meant nothing anymore. Grant's territory stayed untouched through all of it. He never had to lift a hand publicly, never had to prove anything beyond what the ledger already said on its own. His father's legacy, messy and far from innocent, got quietly folded into a version of events the old network preferred to believe, one where the family name stayed intact even if the full truth never did. Grant understood that was simply how these things worked. Some truths surfaced. Others stayed buried by design, and he'd learned to live with which was which. Marnie finally got the answer she'd been chasing since that night in the garage. Her uncle hadn't died from a weak heart or bad luck. He died because he understood exactly what his careful records were worth, and he'd hidden them well enough that it took 30 years and his own niece to finally bring the truth into the light. It didn't undo what happened to him, but it gave her something she hadn't realized she needed, a reason to finally stop wondering. She could have walked away from all of it once the danger passed. Grant expected her to, honestly. A quiet baker with no real ties to this world had every reason to take what she'd learned, close the door on it, and go back to the ordinary life she'd built before a parking garage changed everything. Instead she stayed. Not because she owed him anything. Not because she needed protecting anymore. She stayed because somewhere between the break-in and the ledger and the long nights spent piecing her uncle's story together, she'd stopped being a stranger caught in someone else's war and started being someone Grant genuinely couldn't imagine his life without. Grant thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed, standing at the same window where it had all started, looking down at the same parking garage below. Voss had sent those men that night hoping to expose a weakness, hoping to prove that Grant Whitfield had nothing left in his life worth threatening. In a strange way he'd been right, just not in the way he intended. Grant hadn't had anything worth protecting before that night. He did now. He never won some grand war against Desmond Voss, not really. What actually happened was smaller and stranger than that and far more permanent. A rival trying to destroy him ended up handing him the one thing 3 decades of careful, guarded living had never given him. Someone standing beside him who saw exactly who he was and chose to stay anyway. That, Grant thought, was worth more than anything Voss had ever tried to take from him.